Hello and welcome to the Art of Caro. In this video I'm going to be making something that might turn out quite strange. I'm not super sure about what I'm doing for this. I haven't even started on the pattern yet. But I've been wanting to make like a Renaissance inspired shirt for quite a while, where it has this kind of shoulder puffs and elbow puffs, and the bits between is like straight, and I want that to be all in the same garment instead of like a shirt underneath separate sleeve pieces and stuff like that. And I wanted to make it out of a thinner, cozier fabric, but I didn't have any like concrete idea of what I was going to do. But then I was with my mom at a thrift store and I found this sheet that is really cozy and soft and still a very nice quality. I don't think it has any kind of really thinned out pieces where it's been worn out too much, and it has a tag which says it's 100% cotton, which is brilliant. That's what I like to hear. So I have all these fabric, and I figured I could use that. I usually like a bit more colorful fabric, but I think this is going to look nice on me and like fill out my wardrobe a bit more. But I wanted to do something that had two different textures and like finishes, and I had a little test piece of fabric that was close to this color. It wasn't completely there, but close enough, I feel. So I ordered just half a meter of that fabric, and it's a bit special. It's a cotton muslin. You can iron it, you can throw it in the wash, just the same, but it also has this sparkly sheen. I don't know if you can see it on camera now. I'm gonna blind myself, but hopefully that will help show off how sparkly this fabric is. And I figured I could use this together with this. As you can see, this one is more warm tone, this is more cold tone. I think it's going to be close enough for it to look like it belongs together, but different enough that it's going to have the effect that I want it to have. And I drew up this sketch. This is what I want to make. So I want to make like a shoulder piece that is of the sparkly fabric, and that is completely straight, and then have gathered fabric in the front and in the back from that like shoulder piece. I don't know what to call it. And then I want to make the sleeves with that puffiness and the straightness, and you can see where I'm going with it. I may make like an undersleeve to keep everything where I want it to be and also hide the seam allowances. We shall see after I've cut out what I need out of this fabric. But I think that's how I'm going to end up solving that problem, because I kind of want to make the sleeves even down here big enough that I can draw them over my hands and don't have to like have them super tight around my arms. I want this shirt to be comfortable and not too tight. I mean, I don't mind if it's sort of tight, but I don't really want it to have to be so tight that it can keep everything in place super well. I don't want to have to do all that fitting and stuff. I want this to be a simple garment. So that's what I'm going for. So I'm done with cutting out all my pieces. I thought I would show you all the pieces and try to explain what I'm going to be putting together. So here we are. Here are all the pieces. This first big square is the front. It's going to be gathered up. And I have the back slightly longer, and it's also going to be gathered up. It's not as wide because I don't want it to be as much gathered in the back as it is in the front. Then this is the like shoulder piece. So this is the outer piece and this is the lining. This is the color, and this is going to be a frill on top of it. Yeah, I think a frill is the right term. So on the collar I have the sparkly glittery fabric on the outside and the regular fabric on the inside as lining. This is my lining sleeve pieces, gusset and the sleeve piece, and then I have my outer sleeve, which is the gusset. This is going to be the gathered poof for the shoulder. This is going to be the gathered poof for the elbow. This is the overarm piece, and this is the wrist piece. This is going to be the frills at the wrist. I might have to cut out a couple of new pieces for this because these might be slightly too short. I mean, they won't be gathered a lot. Yeah, ignore it. Yeah, I may have to cut out new pieces of these frills because they are not super wide. As you can see, if you light on top of it, they won't be very gathered, and I thought they would work, but now I'm unsure. So we will have to see when I come to that how these will turn out. So anyways, these are all going to be the shirt. I'm starting out with hemming the frill with a 5mm rolled hem. This was before I properly figured out how to do a rolled hem. And then I did the same to the ends of the frill. And then I'm sewing gathering stitches slightly inside of the seam allowance on the frill and gather that down to the outer portion of the collar. Just making sure that my gatherers are evenly distributed throughout the collar. And then I'm sewing that down. This is also slightly inside the seam allowance. And then I'm pinning the lining to the collar right sides together, capturing that frill between layers and sewing them together, making sure not to trap the ends of the frill when I'm going through that corner there. And then I'm clipping the corners of my seam allowance and turning the collar right side around. Then I'm pressing my collar to make it nice and neat and fiddling with the frills a bit. Here I'm sewing the gathering stitches of first the back and then the front, I think, or maybe the other way around. Just slightly within the seam allowance. And then I'm gathering down the front to the yoke, and as you can see I've marked with pins like the half point and the quarter points and along those lines to make sure that my gatherers are even when I pull them together later on, and that's what I'm doing with all the gatherers I'm doing throughout the rest of the YouTube video, so I'm not going to explain it again, because it's a lot of gathering in this video. And then I'm just securing the end of my thread to that pin on the end. And then I'm fiddling around and making sure that my gatherers are even, and then I'm pinning between the markings. And here I'm doing the same to the back portion of the shirt. Here I'm sewing down the gatherers to the yoke. And here I'm following my seam allowance, and then I'm doing the same for the back portion of the shirt. And then I'm pressing the seam allowance up towards the yoke. And for the front as well. You can see here that the front is more heavily gathered than the back. Just pressing that all nicely. And then I'm pressing up the seam allowance of my lining for the yoke towards the neck area there. So I'm just doing that for the front and the back. And then I'm pinning the lining of the yoke to the outer portion of the yoke, hiding the raw seam allowance for my front and back panels. And then I'm just going to pin the sides and around the neck to be careful, to be sure that they stay in place. Later on off camera I'm basting that down to keep everything where it's supposed to be. As you can see here, when I'm hand sewing down the lining, I have basted it with a yellow thread. I did that off camera, but that's just to keep everything in place and to make sure I don't hurt myself when I'm sewing. And then I'm folding the yoke to find the middle, and I'm marking that point. And then I'm using a ruler to make sure that that actually is the middle. And then I'm drawing a line for my neck opening. I had to pin on the collar just to make sure if that was enough. You're going to see a little bit later. I had to cut it open a bit more than I marked initially. So that's just the neck slit to make it possible to put on and take off the shirt. And then I'm just turning in like a 2mm seam allowance on each side from the outside of the yoke and the lining, and pinning that in place. And then I'm sewing that together using tiny little stitches and making sure it's secure. And then I'm sewing together the bottom of the neck slit. I'm making a little bar there to make sure that it won't be ripped open. So I'm just making a couple of stitches back and forth, and then I'm stitching like around them and then back in. And then I'm sewing gathering stitches, or to me more accurate, easing stitches around the neck, because I accidentally cut the neck hole bigger than I was supposed to. I cut away all my seam allowance. So to fix that, I'm easing the neck opening to the collar to make it fit, and it's not visible on the outside. I can feel it when I'm wearing it, that the collar doesn't match up with the opening, but it isn't really visible. So it turned out fine. Just have to fix it in the future. So just easing that in, and then I'm sewing that down, making sure to only catch the outside portion of the collar when I'm sewing. And then I'm turning under the seam allowance for the lining and pinning that to the neck opening. And then I'm just stitching that down. As you can see, I've basted the seam allowance down again here off screen, making sure my stitches aren't visible on the outside. That's why I'm flipping over the fabric every once in a while. And here I'm sewing together the underarm portions of the sleeve, and I'm ironing open the seam allowance, and then I'm stitching the overarm portion of the sleeve and ironing open the seam allowance there. And then for all pieces, and I just filmed this once, but for all pieces I'm just tacking down like the seam allowance, just to make sure it's not visible on the outside, but just to keep the seam allowance from being messed up. And then I'm sewing the elbow puff and pressing open that seam allowance, and that is also going to be just lightly sewn down. And here are the overarm puff, and here I'm sewing in a gusset. I'm not showing super well how I do that in this video. If you like to know how to do it properly, please leave a comment and I'll do sort of an instruction video on it. Sewing the other portion of the gusset. And then I'm ironing open all those seam allowances. And as I said, I'm sewing down all my seam allowances, and that's just because I noticed sometimes in the wash, if you haven't secured your seam allowances properly, they can like bunch up between the layers, and it gets kind of uncomfortable for me, so I just made sure to tuck them down here. And here I'm sewing the wrist frill using the tiniest French seam I can possibly make. So this is the first time sewing the seam, and then flipping it over and sewing the other part of the French seam. And then I'm sewing down the French seam, securing it to the fabric. And here I finally figured out how to do a proper rolled hem. So that's what I'm doing, a teeny tiny rolled hem. And then I'm sewing gathering stitches on the frill, just slightly within the seam allowance. And then I'm gathering that down onto the wrist portion of the outer sleeve. And I'm using the same method as I showed previously to make sure that my gatherers are even. And then I'm sewing that down a bit awkwardly, because it was a bit awkward, so this when I couldn't put it on that arm of my sewing machine. Then I'm sewing gatherers slightly within the seam allowance of the shoulder puff, and I'm gathering that down to the upper portion of the overarm piece of the oversleeve. I don't know how to categorize all my pieces really. And then I'm sewing that together. It went much more smoothly on this big piece. Lots of gatherers in this project. And then I'm gathering down the elbow portion, the elbow puff portion, to the overarm portion of the outer sleeve, and then I'm sewing that down. And then I'm pinning the lower part of the elbow puff to the upper part of the underarm portion of the over sleeve. It's really hard to explain what I'm doing at this point, and I'm just making sure that the gatherers are even, as always. And then I'm sewing those together. And then I'm sewing the gusset to the lining sleeve, and lining up the other part of the gusset and pinning that, and sewing that down. And then I'm pinning the rest of the lining sleeve and sewing that down. And then I'm pressing out the seam allowance for the lining sleeve and pinning it, and then I'm just going to sew down the seam allowance as I did before. And then I am attaching the lining to the outer sleeve just by putting them right sides together and pinning it down. And the frill, when I sewed that on the wrist previously, I did that just slightly within the seam allowance. So when I'm now sewing it properly on the seam allowance, that stitching won't be visible. Wow, I've gotten quite a bit into this, and I haven't talked to the camera a lot because I've had stuff going on. Anyway, I've gotten the body portion completely done. I mean, except for the side seams, but I'm not counting that in right now because I'm going to sew the side seams at the same time as I'm sewing in the sleeves. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about was the sleeves. So I've sewn in the lining to the outer portion of the sleeves, and I'm going to have this mess when I turn them out. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to turn the lining to the inside, but I'm going to do it like a portion at a time. And before I'm doing that, I'm probably going to be basting down the seam allowance. So the seam allowance comes at the right side of my my outer sleeve. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to let's just show one sleeve at a time. Okay, what's going to happen is I'm going to first attempt to understitch the seam allowance here to the lining layer. I'm going to have to do it by hand because I'm not going to be able to do this on the machine. I just can't. But I'm going to stitch along here by hand to make sure that the seam allowance pulls the lining inside, so it doesn't start poking up and affecting how this frill is sticking out. And then I'm going to baste the seam allowance on the puffy portions of the sleeve to the poofs. So I want the seam allowance to be on this side, so it helps the poofs, you know, poof out. And then when I'm done with that, I'm probably going to have to do some markings on the lining sleeve. And this is the really tricky bit. I'm going to turn the sleeve allowance to the inside, like this. And then I'm going to make sure that they align properly, step by step. So first the wrist portion I'm going to place right along the lining. Then I'm going to attempt to stitch down the seam allowance to the lining layer, just lightly to keep it in place. So when I have assembled the entire sleeve and it's all done, the poofs will stay where they are supposed to, and the smooth portion will stay where it's supposed to. If I don't do this, it's going to be all wrinkly like this, and I want these portions to be straight and these portions to be poofy. And then this portion of the outer sleeve is going to be gathered down and just stitched down to the lining, and then this portion is just going to be French seamed into the side of the body portion of the shirt. I don't know if this is clarifying anything at all. It's kind of weird. I realize that. And yeah, so I'm just going to go for it, and hopefully I'm going to be able to show what I'm doing. So here I'm just sewing down the seam allowance of the wrist there with running stitches to make it secure. And now I'm marking out my sections on my sleeve lining, so I will know where to sew down my different portions. This is going to be the wrist portion, elbow puff, overarm portion, and shoulder puff. And as you can see, it gets a bit weird here at the gusset, but I don't think it's going to be too much of a bother. Yes, I'm just making those markings on both sides, so it's all the way around when I later on start pinning to them. And then I'm basting down my seam allowance for the puff, where the seam allowance is going to be turned away from me when I eventually start to stitch down my oversleeve. And then I'm turning my sleeve around, and I'm pinning my first section to the line I drew, and that is the straight underarm portion. And then I'm sewing down the seam allowance to keep that in place. And this is how it turns out. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. So now I'm pinning that portion where the seam allowance is away from me. So I'm just pinning it and sewing it, just making sure to just catch the fabric that I want to catch. And that's what it looks like, and I'm removing the basting. And then I'm sewing down the last portion. I'm using running stitches with an occasional back stitch to just sew down the seam allowance to the lining. And that's the result. So now I'm just gathering down my shoulder puff to the lining and pinning it, and just securing that in place, so the sleeves are now one big piece. Which makes it much more easy to deal with. Here I'm pinning my side seams, and I'm putting in my my sleeves, and I'm sewing them down. This is going to be French seams, so this is just the first pass. And then I'm sewing the side seams, and then I'm just trimming off the seam allowance and turning it around and creating my French seam and pinning that. If you want to see how you sew in arms with gasset like this with a French seam, Morgan Donner has a really good instruction video. So this is my second pass for for the French seam, and this is the finished look. So I'm done! I'm pretty satisfied with this project. I think it turned out well. There are a few things I would change when I'm going to do this again, because I'm definitely doing this again because I love how I look. I like the Renaissance feel of it, and sort of I think I could do some fun nightcore inspired outfits for this. Yeah, so what I would like to change when I do it again is, first off, I accidentally made the neck hole bigger than it was supposed to be, so I had to ease it into the collar. I essentially just cut away my seam allowance, and I don't know how that happened. But anyway, so proper neck opening. Another thing I would fix is the fact that the poofs are a bit more floppy than I would like. So instead of making them twice the length of the distance they are meant to cover, I'm going to make them 1.5, and I'm also going to make them wider so they are a bit more densely gathered. I think the poofs will be a bit more poofy that way. Not that this isn't a fun look, but I was going for more of a poofy poof look. The frills on the wrist I would also make more densely gathered. They are currently twice the distance around my wrist, so I would make them 3 times maybe, or maybe even 4 if I feel like it. And have fabric for it. So what I'm super happy with is how the sleeve lining turned out, and the gathering on the front and the back. The fact that I have more densely gathered at the front and more sparse gatherers at the back, I think that turned out lovely. And I like my smooth portions, and I like the sparkle, and that it's not too much sparkle, but there's some sparkle. And that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. May the stars shine upon your faces and have a glorious day. Thank you, and goodbye for now. Sorry about the background. I was going to film the reveal outside, but the weather just won't cooperate with me. So if I was going to get this out when I wanted it to get out, this would have to be it. So sorry.